We are now jumping ahead to chapter 31, in which we are going to be talking about the nervous system and nerve cells. We've been talking a lot about cells, but we're now going to focus in specifically on the neuron and the nerve cells that make up your nervous system. And the big thing here is that we've been talking about how these cells are the one cell in your body that can't regenerate, that can't regrow itself. And that had been true for 100 or more years. Scientists firmly believed that neurons and nerve cells could not regenerate, they could not regrow themselves, that there were not nerve cell stem cells, that it was just impossible. But what research has shown in the last year is that this isn't entirely true, and that there are strong possibilities that nerve cells can be regrown. So if you look at some of the research and headlines that are out there, brain cell regeneration is possible. And in this study they did in Princeton University, they used monkeys in which monkeys were regrowing brain cells in certain parts of the brain, specifically in the decision-making part of the brain, the visual sight portion of the brain, and the portion of the brain that recognizes things in 3 dimensions. This research here was done on those for cancer treatment, where brain cells had been killed off by radiation treatment, and they were able to wake up these hibernating neural brain stem cells and wake them up and grow new brain cells to replace the injured cells and potentially restore the lost function. And this was done in mice at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. So there are studies being done in which brain stem cells have been discovered, and we can regrow these brain cells. So the possibilities are there. Doubtful it's going to be like your skin cells or your stomach cells, which replace themselves very easily and quickly, but you never know. Maybe someday it will be that simple, but odds are that it probably won't happen like your skin cells or your stomach cells. But there does the possibility does exist that these brain cells can regrow themselves. So let's take a look specifically at a brain cell, which is called a neuron, which is on page 897 in your book if you're following along. The brain cell looks a little different than most of the cells we've been talking about. This is the cell body of the cell, containing the nucleus that you see here, which would contain the DNA, surrounded by the cytoplasm. So that part, not the typical shape of the cells we've been talking about, but has the nucleus, the cytoplasm, the organelles, and that's where you find the meat of the cell and the cell body. The cell also has these branch tree-like things here, which are referred to as dendrites. Okay. Dendrites receive impulses and carry impulses to the cell body, to the information center. Remember, the nucleus is the information center. So they are receiving, the dendrites are receiving information that they are giving then to the nucleus. That information is then transferred down the long part of the cell called the axon. This is a long fiber that carries impulses from the cell body, away from the cell body. So this very long fiber carrying these impulses. So the impulses are collected by the dendrites and then sent by the cell body down this long fiber, which is called an axon. Now, some of these axons are covered with a sheath, which is called a myelin sheath, which is a protective coating. So if you imagine this is a wire with a plastic coating on it. So the axon is the wire carrying the information, and the sheath is the protective coating. And much like beads is how it presents itself. If you were threading beads onto a wire or threading popcorn onto a string at Christmas, that's what the little nylon sheaths would look like, and they have little nodes in between them. These then it ends in what are called the axon terminal. The axon terminal can then transfer this information to, say, a muscle, telling the muscle to contract. Or it could transfer this information to another nerve cell, because sometimes the message has to be passed down multiple nerve cells, from one nerve cell to the next neuron, to the next neuron, to the next neuron. So the axon terminal is the end of the neuron, the nerve cell, and that information will then be passed along from the axon terminal to another neuron or to a organ, an endpoint per se. It pretty much kind of sums this up. If you wanted to sketch this into your notes, that would be good, along with putting in the information about what each part does. You most often see these neurons bundled up together, and that bundle of neurons is what we call a nerve when you talk about your nerves. So some of your nerves have one or very few neurons, where some of your nerves are bundles of hundreds or thousands of these neurons. Just depends on what part of your body we're talking about. So as I said, the axon terminal at the end of one nerve cell can connect to the dendrites of another nerve cell, or it could connect to the muscle cell, for instance. So the axon terminal at the end is a gap located at the end of it, and that's called the synapse. And this is where that neuron can transfer the impulse to another cell or to a muscle. So there would be, for instance, a slight gap between the axon terminal, the ending of one nerve cell, and the dendrite of another nerve cell. Or there would be this gap between the axon terminal and a muscle cell. And that gap is the synapse, and it's where the neuron will transfer the impulse. There are chemicals that carry that impulse across, and those are called neurotransmitters. So they carry the impulse across the synapse to another cell, whether that's another nerve cell or whether that's like a muscle cell, and the brain is sending a signal, an impulse to that muscle cell to do something, like to contract. That's called the synapse, and that's where that impulse is carried across. So you have different types of neurons. They fall into two major groups: the sensory neurons, which carry the impulse from the sensory organ to the spinal cord and the brain. And those, think about your five senses. That's what we mean by the sensory neurons. And then there are the motor neurons, which receive the impulse from the sensory neurons and process that, and then they will send a message back out to your muscles and like your glands. So the sensory neurons are those that are gathering the information and sending it to the spinal cord and the brain, and the motor neurons are those that then take the response from the brain and send that back out to your muscles and glands. And then there are something called the interneurons, which connect your sensory and your motor neurons. So if we look at it in terms of two major divisions, you have your peripheral nervous system and your central nervous system. Your peripheral nervous system gathers the information and sends it to your central nervous system. So this is the sensory neurons. The peripheral nervous system is your sensory neurons that are gathering that information and sending it to the central nervous system, which is your brain and your spinal cord, that is processing that information. then sending a signal back out to the peripheral nervous system that is a response to that original information. So this is collecting information, processing information, responding to that information. So it's a matter of collecting the information, processing it, and responding to that information using the two nervous systems, the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. So that breaks down your neurons and the how they basically function. And we're going to start looking at those more in depth. And for one interesting fact, what is the longest nerve cell in a human? And the correct answer is the sciatic nerve, which attaches from the base of the spinal cord all the way to your big toe, averaging 3 feet in length.